Imagine your government giving your homeland to another country, forcing you from your home, and never allowing you to return. This isn't fiction. It's the reality for over 1,000 Chagossians who were systematically removed from their islands between 1968 and 1973. Their tropical paradise was transformed into a military base that would later launch bombing missions over Iraq and Afghanistan. Today, Diego Garcia remains the only inhabited island in the Chagos archipelago, now home exclusively to US-UK forces. But what was life like in this remote corner of the Indian Ocean before it became a strategic military outpost? What exactly did these displaced people lose when they were forced to abandon their homeland? Diego Garcia, Paradise Lost. To understand what the Chagossians lost, we need to journey to their homeland. The Chagos archipelago sits isolated in the Indian Ocean, roughly halfway between Tanzania and Indonesia. This collection of over 60 small coral islands forms a horseshoe shape, with Diego Garcia, the largest island at about 17 square miles, located at the southern tip. Its distinctive footprint-like shape, with a wide lagoon opening to the north, would later become strategically significant. The island's remoteness from major shipping lanes and population centers initially allowed the Chagossian community to develop in relative isolation. This same remoteness would later become their greatest vulnerability when global powers recognized the strategic military potential of their position. Before the forced removals, approximately 1,000 to 1,200 people called these islands home. The Chagossian people formed a distinct community with their own unique culture, shaped by their ancestors who arrived on the islands in the late 18th century. Most Chagossians descended from enslaved Africans brought to work on coconut plantations by French colonizers. Following British acquisition of the islands after the Napoleonic Wars, indentured laborers from India joined this population. Over generations, these diverse origins blended into a singular Chagossian identity with its own language, Chagossian Creole, a French-based dialect incorporating words from African and Asian languages. Religious practices primarily centered around Catholicism, though infused with unique island traditions. The community developed strong social bonds, with extended family networks forming the foundation of island life. Their daily existence centered around self-sufficiency. The coconut industry formed the economic backbone of the islands, with many residents working on plantations producing copra, dried coconut kernels used to extract oil. Each month, ships would arrive to collect this copra and bring basic supplies. Beyond plantation work, Chagossians established elaborate fishing traditions adapted to their specific marine environment, using techniques passed through generations to harvest the abundant reef fish and seasonal catches. Women managed households, prepared food, tended gardens, and participated in community ceremonies. Children grew up with remarkable freedom, learning practical skills from their elders while absorbing cultural knowledge through oral traditions. With little formal education available on the islands, knowledge transmission happened through direct practice and storytelling. The islands themselves provided an idyllic setting. Diego Garcia features a nearly continuous white sand beach encircling a turquoise lagoon. Coconut palms dominate the landscape, with the island's interior filled with dense tropical vegetation. The surrounding waters contain extensive coral reefs harboring diverse marine life. The climate remains consistently warm year-round, with distinct wet and dry seasons. This natural abundance supported the Chagossian lifestyle for generations. Community celebrations marked important life events and religious holidays. Music played a central role in Chagossian culture, with songs incorporating African rhythms, European melodies, and lyrics reflecting island experiences. Dancing brought the community together during celebrations, with styles showing both African and European influences. The Chagossian community maintained complex social structures despite their small population. Leaders emerged based on age, wisdom, and demonstrated ability rather than formal positions. conflicts resolved through community mediation rather than external legal systems. This relatively egalitarian society shared resources during difficult times and celebrated abundance together when fishing or harvests proved particularly successful. Many elders would later recall their life on the islands as one of complete self-sufficiency. "We had everything we needed," one elder told filmmaker John Pilger. "The sea gave us fish. The land gave us coconuts and fruits. We built our homes, made our clothes, and lived without needing anything from the outside world until they came and took it all away. The isolation that allowed." This unique culture to develop also kept the Chagossians largely unknown to the outside world. Few visitors reached the islands before the mid-20th century. The Chagossians maintained limited communication with Mauritius and Seychelles through monthly supply ships, but otherwise existed outside global awareness. This invisibility to the international community would prove devastating when their homeland became a target for military planners. By the late 1950s, subtle changes began occurring. British administrators visited more frequently. Unknown to the islanders, their homeland had entered strategic discussions in Washington and London. Military surveyors appeared, taking measurements and photographs while offering little explanation to residents. The Chagossians, with limited access to news from the outside world, couldn't comprehend the geopolitical forces about to upend their existence. This distinctive way of life remained largely intact until the 1960s. For nearly 2 centuries, generations of Chagossians built a society adapted to their environment and circumstances. They developed customs, traditions, and social structures suited to their isolated tropical home. Their community proved remarkably resilient against natural challenges like storms and occasional supply shortages. However, they had no defenses against the political machinations of distant superpowers. The extraordinary tragedy of the Chagossian story lies in how completely unprepared they were for what came next. Their fate would be determined in classified meetings thousands of miles away by people who had never set foot on their islands. The same isolation that had protected their unique way of life left them vulnerable to removal without witnesses or advocates. Their paradise existed outside the view of journalists, human rights organizations, or international observers who might have raised alarms. As the Cold War intensified during the early 1960s, American military planners began viewing the Indian Ocean as a strategic vacuum needing a permanent U.S. presence. The remote location and protected lagoon of Diego Garcia presented an ideal position for monitoring Soviet movements and projecting military power across a vast region. This strategic potential placed the islands directly in the crosshairs of superpower competition, a tiny speck on the map suddenly becoming the focus of intense interest from global powers. Cold War calculations. The strategic implications of Diego Garcia's location became clear to American military planners in the early 1960s. As the Cold War intensified, control over the world's oceans took on new strategic significance. The nuclear arms race accelerated, proxy conflicts erupted across developing nations, and the Cuban Missile Crisis had pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Soviet Union had begun expanding its naval presence beyond its traditional operating areas in the North Atlantic and Pacific. Between 1963 and 1965, Soviet vessels increasingly appeared in the Indian Ocean, conducting surveillance operations and establishing diplomatic relationships with newly independent nations in the region. This expansion alarmed American military planners, who identified a critical vulnerability in their global military posture: the lack of a permanent base in the vast Indian Ocean region. U.S. military strategists needed a location that could support long-range bombers, naval vessels, and intelligence operations across an enormous area. Any suitable site needed specific characteristics: deep natural harbors, potential for long runways, minimal civilian population, and most importantly, political reliability. The Pentagon analyzed dozens of potential locations before identifying the Chagos archipelago and specifically Diego Garcia, as their ideal candidate. The island offered multiple advantages that military planners couldn't overlook. Its horseshoe shape created a naturally protected deep-water lagoon perfect for naval operations. The island's flat coral foundation could support the construction of lengthy runways for strategic bombers and transport aircraft. Most critically, its remote position placed it almost equidistant from potential conflict zones in the Middle East, East Africa, and Southeast Asia, essentially at the center of an enormous strategic triangle. In 1961, American officials approached their British counterparts about the possibility of establishing a military facility on Diego Garcia. These initial discussions remained classified, with both governments recognizing the politically sensitive nature of the proposal. Britain still controlled many colonial territories, but faced increasing international pressure to grant independence to its remaining colonies. The potential displacement of the Shagoshian population presented obvious political complications. For 3 years, British and American diplomats negotiated the terms of a potential agreement while conducting detailed surveys of Diego Garcia. These assessments confirmed the island's suitability for military purposes while also documenting the existing population. Internal memoranda from this period reveal that both governments understood removing the Chagossians would present legal and ethical challenges, but considered these obstacles manageable through appropriate administrative measures. By December 1966, negotiations culminated in a formal agreement between the United States and United Kingdom regarding the use of Diego Garcia. This document, known as the Exchange of Notes, granted the United States military access to Diego Garcia for an initial period of 50 years with an option to extend for an additional 20 years. In exchange, the United States provided the United Kingdom with a $14 million discount on Polaris nuclear missiles, a transaction that effectively valued the Chagos Islands at far less than their strategic worth. This agreement contained a critical stipulation: the islands must be cleaned and sanitized before transfer to American control. The euphemistic language masked what both governments understood: the complete removal of the indigenous population. The American military insisted on exclusive control without the complications of a civilian population. British officials accommodated this demand, viewing the Chagossians as expendable compared to the strategic partnership with the United States. Before finalizing this arrangement, the British government had already taken preparatory legal steps. On November 8, 1965, the United Kingdom detached the Chagos archipelago from Mauritius through the British Indian Ocean Territory Order. This administrative maneuver created an entirely new colonial entity, the British Indian Ocean Territory, BIOT, consisting solely of the Chagos Islands. This action directly contravened United Nations resolutions on decolonization, which prohibited the breakup of colonial territories prior to independence. The creation of BIOT employed a rarely used legal mechanism called an Order in Council, which allowed the British government to make significant territorial changes without parliamentary debate or public scrutiny. This deliberate circumvention of normal democratic processes kept the planned military base and population removal hidden from public view. The legal restructuring occurred just 3 years before Mauritius gained independence in 1968, effectively preventing the new nation from claiming sovereignty over Chagos. British diplomats secured Mauritian consent for this detachment during independence negotiations by making it a non-negotiable condition for independence. Mauritian leaders later claimed they were coerced into accepting the arrangement, having been told independence would be denied if they refused to surrender the islands. The British offered £3 million in compensation, a figure that vastly undervalued the territory being surrendered. Throughout the negotiations between the United States and United Kingdom, a conspicuous absence emerged in the official records: any serious consideration of the Shagoshian people's rights or interests. Declassified documents reveal a calculated decision to characterize the Chagossians not as a permanent population with territorial rights, but as floating contract workers temporarily residing on the islands. This legal fiction created a pretext for their removal without triggering international protections for indigenous populations. In private communications, officials acknowledged this misrepresentation. British diplomats noted that many Shagoshian families had lived on the islands for multiple generations and maintained a distinct cultural identity. Nevertheless, public statements consistently referred to them as migrant labourers to justify their imminent displacement. The British Foreign Office explicitly instructed officials to avoid any language that would recognise the Shagoshians as a permanent population. The 1966 agreement effectively sealed the fate of the Shagoshian people, though they remained unaware of the decisions made thousands of miles away. The document contained no provisions for their welfare, resettlement, or compensation. Their existence registered merely as a logistical obstacle to be removed before the military construction could begin. Not a single Shagoshian representative participated in any stage of the negotiations that would destroy their community. With the legal framework established and the bilateral agreement secured, British officials began planning the systematic removal of the entire Shagoshian population. The Cold War calculation was clear. The strategic value of Diego Garcia as a military asset outweighed any humanitarian concerns about displacing an isolated indigenous population. In the geopolitical mathematics of the era, over 1,000 Shagoshians registered as an acceptable sacrifice to counter Soviet influence across the Indian Ocean region. This utilitarian logic would soon translate into a methodical campaign to empty the islands of their inhabitants through increasingly brutal methods. The calculated removal. The implementation phase of the Chagos removal began in 1968, transforming abstract policy into concrete action. British officials executed a carefully planned operation spanning 5 years, designed to gradually empty the islands while minimizing international attention. This methodical approach allowed them to dismantle an entire community without generating the headlines that a single mass deportation might have created. The first phase targeted Shagoshians who had temporarily left the islands. When residents traveled to Mauritius for medical treatment, family visits, or educational opportunities, British authorities simply prevented their return. Ships that normally would have carried these individuals back to their homes refused to take them. Officials provided no explanation beyond vague references to new regulations. This tactic effectively trapped dozens of Shagoshians in Mauritius, separated from their families and possessions still on the islands. Those caught in this initial phase included pregnant women who had gone to Mauritius to give birth, patients who had sought treatment for illnesses beyond the limited medical facilities on the islands, and students attempting to pursue education unavailable on Chagos. Many found themselves stranded without housing, employment, or support networks in Mauritius. Their sudden displacement served as a testing ground for the larger removals to follow. Behind closed doors, the attitudes driving these policies became apparent in internal British government communications. In a 1966 diplomatic cable, Colonial Office head Dennis Greenhill referred to the Shagoshians as Tarzans and Men Fridays, revealing the dehumanizing colonial mindset that facilitated their removal. This language transformed real people with established communities into fictional characters, easier to displace without moral consequence. Such dehumanization continued throughout the operation, with official documents consistently avoiding terms that would acknowledge the Shagoshians' permanent connection to the islands. As the operation progressed, British authorities escalated their tactics. Regular supply ships that had previously delivered essential goods to the islands became increasingly infrequent. Food supplies dwindled, with officials restricting imports of basic necessities. The small medical facilities that served the islands received fewer shipments of medicine. Transportation between islands within the archipelago became limited, isolating communities from one another. These measures created growing hardship designed to make continued residence impossible. By 1971, the operation entered its most disturbing phase. Bounty Commissioner Bruce Greatbatch ordered the killing of all dogs on Diego Garcia, pets that families had kept for generations, and working animals essential to plantation operations. Government agents systematically rounded up these animals and gassed them in sheds using exhaust fumes from military vehicles. This act served as both psychological warfare and a clear signal that no aspect of normal life would continue. Owners watched helplessly as their pets were taken, returning later to find mass graves of animals. This deliberate cruelty demonstrated the authorities' willingness to inflict trauma to achieve their objectives. As sections of the islands emptied, government contractors systematically destroyed the physical evidence of community existence. Workers dismantled homes stone by stone, often beginning the process while nearby houses remained occupied. Community buildings that had served as gathering places for generations, small churches, meeting halls, and processing facilities were razed. Gardens that had provided food for families were bulldozed. Each demolition eliminated another piece of tangible evidence that people had lived on these islands for generations, while simultaneously preparing the terrain for military construction. Mauritian contractor Marcel Mouliny, who had managed plantations on Diego Garcia, described the devastation. All the houses were broken down. They were trying to turn the place into a desert. The physical destruction served multiple purposes: preventing Chagossians from returning to intact homes, eliminating evidence of permanent settlement, and preparing the terrain for military construction. The systematic erasure of buildings also broke community resistance by demonstrating the irreversibility of the removal. By 1973, the remaining Chagossians faced direct deportation. British officials arrived with cargo ships and informed islanders they had days, or sometimes just hours, to gather belongings before departure. The limited space on these vessels meant families could bring only what they could carry, a fraction of their possessions accumulated over generations. Furniture, tools, family, heirlooms, and most household goods remained behind. Some families reported having just minutes to decide which items to save before being forced onto waiting ships. These cargo vessels were designed for transporting goods, not people. Chagossians described overcrowded conditions with inadequate facilities for the journey to Mauritius or Seychelles. One deportee, Rita Bankout, recalled, "We were packed like animals in the bottom of the boat. There were no bathrooms. Many became seasick. Children were crying." The journey lasted several days in these conditions, with passengers receiving minimal food and water. Upon arrival, most had no idea where they would live or how they would survive. Throughout this entire process, the British government maintained an official position that no permanent population existed on the islands. Government communications consistently referred to the Chagossians as contract workers, temporarily present on the plantations, rather than a distinct community with generational ties to the land. This classification as transient laborers, rather than an indigenous population, allowed officials to bypass international protections that would have prevented their removal. This legal fiction continued in public statements and diplomatic communications. When questioned about the deportations, British officials claimed they were simply closing unproductive plantations and relocating contract workers whose employment had ended. This misrepresentation ignored documented evidence that many Chagossian families had lived on the islands for 5 or more generations, developed a distinct cultural identity, and considered the archipelago their homeland. By April 27, 1973, the operation concluded with the final deportation of Chagossians from Peros Banhos Atoll. In just 5 years, British authorities had completely emptied the archipelago of its native population. The islands that had supported human communities for nearly 2 centuries stood vacant, ready for military construction to begin. The approximately 1,000 to 1,200 displaced Chagossians arrived in Mauritius and Seychelles with minimal resources and no clear path forward,